Distribution provided by Cloud Sigma, the cloud that adapts to you. Visit cloudsigma.com/thisweekin for a free $200 credit.
Today's episode of This Week in Venture Capital is brought to you by Walker Corporate Law, a boutique corporate law firm specializing in the representation of entrepreneurs, and by Detroit Venture Partners, an early-stage fund with an all-digital strategy. DVP is run by entrepreneurs for entrepreneurs.
Make sure to tune in today. My guest is none other than Steve Blank, the champion of customer development. We're going to learn about customer development and a whole lot more today.
Yeah. I think we're gonna get good. Ride through my city, jealous ones still envy. And they hate me with a passion, even though they never met me.
Welcome to This Week in Venture Capital. I'm super excited today. My guest, Steve Blank. Welcome.
Thanks for having me, Mark.
And it's great to have you in Los Angeles.
Yeah, great to be here.
What brings you to LA?
Well, we're teaching our Lean Launchpad class for the first time at Caltech, and it's pretty exciting.
Your Lean Launchpad class. What is a Lean Launchpad class?
So over the last 10 years, customer development and Lean, my contributions, Eric Ries's contributions, Alexander Osterwalder's, have all ended up kind of concatenated in a class that teaches entrepreneurs basically the basics of all this, how to get out of the building, what a customer is, what business model design is, and we do it in a very experiential way. I've taught the class at Stanford, at Berkeley, at Columbia, and now there's a 5-day version here at Caltech.
Great. And you actually are teaching the class online as well, if I'm not mistaken. Is that a similar class, or?
Right. It's exactly all the lectures I used in not only the Stanford and Berkeley and Caltech classes, but also this class is taught for the National Science Foundation. The U.S. government kind of standardized on this class on how to take the best of our science and research and commercialize it. And so I originally recorded lectures online for them, and then we discovered, well, wait a minute, it shouldn't just only be for the few at the NSF. Why don't we open this up to the entire world? And so I worked with the best online education company I could find, Udacity, and actually put it online, and it went live last week. And if you go to udacity.com and look for EP245, the Lean Launchpad, you'll find this class, and you'll be in good company with 50 or 100,000 other students now worldwide.
50 to 100,000 students.
50,000 the last time I looked, and so it's still climbing. So
that's phenomenal. And how does it work? If people want to sign up for this course, it's just at udacity.com.
That's correct.
And I presume they can just type in Steve Blank when they get there?
They type in Steve Blank or look for the Lean Launchpad. It's completely free. Right now, they could form their own teams or take the class singularly. It doesn't require the purchase of any books, though having the book kind of helps, but a lot of materials online. Basically, the lectures are self-paced, but we give you homework for each lecture of what to do to get out of the building. And
so it's part watching online video.
Yep.
It's part having tools to be able to communicate with other people. Yep. But because I actually went and I watched a few of the courses, I guess I won't call them episodes, which I thought was great. It actually encourages you to get a group of people together and start a company while you're watching the video.
That's right. And
so crazy.
So the goal is, if you think about how I teach the class, this is the material that would be the lectures inside, but the real course is not, entrepreneurship is not about sitting in a classroom and taking notes. It's not how smart you are. It's actually, in fact, what I remind my students, who are truly at times the smartest person in the classroom, I remind them that, entrepreneurs are the ones who realize that collectively their customers are a lot smarter than they are.
Yeah.
And unless they get out of the building and figure that out, they're never going to get smarter. So the class is about taking the information I'm going to teach you, but how to use it outside and get smarter. And it teaches you what is it you're supposed to know.
How did you come up with this idea of customer development? How did it occur to you? How did you start to define a methodology? How did you start teaching?
Yeah, that's, I was a serial entrepreneur, which means I failed one company at a time. I did 8 companies in 21 years in Silicon Valley, 2 semiconductor companies, supercomputers, military intelligence, enterprise software, video games. And the score at the end of 21 years was 4 IPOs, but 2 craters so deep they left their own iridium layer. And in fact, in one of them, my next to last startup, I lost $35 million of other people's money. And when I did that, I called up my mother, who was a Russian immigrant. She was alive at the time, and said, "Mom, I've lost $35 million. And like there was silence. And then finally, she was translating it into English. She said, "Well, where'd you put it?" I said, "Well, no. I didn't misplace it. I lost it." And then she broke into Russian and said, "You're going to have to leave the country. There's nowhere else for us to go," and blah, blah, blah. I said, no. I'm actually calling you now because the same guys are just going to give me $12 million to do my new company. And then she said in multiple languages, "Only in America are the streets paved with gold," which reminds me, it's something I tell foreign visitors to Silicon Valley who have a hard time grasping the following. I ask them, "Do you know what special word we use for a failed entrepreneur in Silicon Valley?" And they come up and the word we use, which is what makes startup clusters so exceptional, the word we use for a failed entrepreneur is experienced.
Right.
And the big idea was I was able to take a miserable failure, and it was an honest failure, but pretty miserable, raise another $12 million and return $1 billion each to the 2 VCs, which is why now I'm teaching.
Right. And that was Epiphany?
It was Epiphany. It was an enterprise software company, and it happened to be in a bubble, and I wasn't confused. There were multiple zeros after it that shouldn't have been in a normal time, but it still would have been a profitable company. It was truly delivered value to enterprise customers.
Yeah.
But to answer your question, after I retired, I started to, believe it or not, think that what the world really needed was my memoirs. And I was going to write a memoir, and everybody would love it. And as I started typing it, and as I started typing each company I've been into, I started doing what I called lessons learned. What was the summary that I learned out of each company? And by then I had been sitting on not only my boards, but I was on 2 public company boards and investing, and didn't have enough experience to be a VC, but a lot for an entrepreneur. And all of a sudden I got to page 80 and realized that I was seeing a pattern that no one had ever described before. That the way I had failed, and I'd seen others failed, wasn't a failure of technology, but a failure of market and customers.
Right.
And while we had plenty of methodologies for managing the product, we had no methodology other than war stories and who had a great Rolodex on how to manage the process outside the building. And I said, this couldn't be, no. And so by then I had a bunch of friends on Sand Hill Road and went to talk to them. I said, and the best ones said, like Bill Davidow and Don Valentine, "Well, Steve, of course." And you went, "Of course? How come you guys haven't written it down?" Well, that's not our job. And I started to realize that what was missing was a methodology for entrepreneurs, by entrepreneurs, that could reduce early stage risk. What I found out later, and I could concatenate the learnings maybe into 2 sentences, if you'll let me run on for a second.
Please.
Is that the distinction that we had never made was that what we do in existing companies is we execute known business models.
Right.
And in fact, we built a cadre, a management class, to go to school to learn how to execute, and they get a degree called the Masters of Business Administration.
Yep.
Not the masters of startups, but the masters on how to administer and execute existing companies. And we had an incredibly deep management stack over the last 100 years. Operations and strategy and finance and accounting and organizational theory, etc. But we had no equivalent stack because we had no idea that we'd do something different. And the insight I had is while large companies execute, startups search.
Right.
In their first year. And the question is, search for what? Well, if you really think about it, and this is where Alexander Osterwalder's work comes in, large companies execute known business models. Startups are actually searching for a business model. And a business model is a fancy term for all the pieces that make up your company, whether it's the product or customer segments or revenue model or customer relationships, all the components. That's what we're actually doing in the first year. It's not a given we know what to do. And the problem is that Silicon Valley VCs came from the execution side and tried to force fit all that onto startups. I don't know if any of this makes sense.
No, it makes a lot of sense.
And so really what we needed was to develop our own management stack, our own tools.
Right.
And so my customer development work, when Eric Ries had the insight, Eric was the best student I ever had. I was his investor, sat on his board, he took my class, he smacked me on the side of the head and said, no, it's not product management, it's agile engineering. Steve, you're out of date, and then added that. And customer development plus agile became the first kind of implementations of lean. So Eric's work, Osterwalder's work, my work are the beginnings of the first part of a parallel to what you learn at Harvard. You now need to learn about startups.
So you said something interesting, and I want to come back to your teachings in just a moment, but you talked about failure in Silicon Valley. One of my favorite sayings is that good judgment comes from experience, but experience comes from bad judgment. Right? So it's the failure of your first company that allows you to know what to do differently in your second company. I often use the parallel of children. You can tell children not to make the same mistakes you did. Oh, the girl you meet in high school is probably not going to be your only love forever. Oh, try not to drink a little too much alcohol, or, whatever. You can try to give them experiences. They kind of got to learn on their own. And there's some of that, I think, involved in startups. So I wanted to ask you this, though, is you mentioned it's the culture of Silicon Valley that allows it. I built my first company in London. London did not have a failure culture. It did not have a culture that tolerated failure. You were seen as tarnished goods if you made mistakes.
Yep.
How do you think that culture emerged in Silicon Valley? Because I know you've written a lot about the history of Silicon Valley. And isn't that one of the most important ingredients if we're going to want to build startup cultures in other places?
Right. So, people don't remember, I teach a bunch of eager 20-year-olds, and when you ask who founded Silicon Valley, they talk about this old dead guy named Steve Jobs. And you kind of go, well, no, I don't think so. He was about in fact, he was my age. Yeah. Silicon Valley actually started with a bunch of scientists and engineers, and in fact, there were multiple paths to founding the valley. But if one looked at the semiconductor folks, Shockley and then Fairchild Semiconductor were founded by a bunch of physicists and chemists and whatever, and the valley was all about the scientific method. That is, you had hypotheses, things blew up in the lab, they didn't work, you didn't get fired, unless you burned down the building on purpose. Yeah. And so it was a series of experiments, and so we had a culture where failure was an integral part of what we did. MBAs didn't even show up till 15 years later, because no one would be crazy enough to go to work with a bunch of crazy engineers and scientists here. So I think part of that came from the engineering culture. The other part came from World War II, believe it or not, when we enlisted universities to build weapon systems for the United States.
Right.
Nuclear weapons, radar, electronic warfare, cryptography. And in a crisis, that is in a wartime crisis, people, in fact, insist that you run 1 million experiments at a time, and it's okay if most of them fail if what comes out is a useful weapon or idea. And so in crises, we tend to be very good at experimentation. Silicon Valley is in perpetual crises, and our culture embraces the fact that you will make a ton of mistakes. I mean, where else can a financial asset class, we happen to call risk capital, could tell to its investors, we're going to fail 90% of the time.
But so do you think, if I could distill that, is it the...
Good, I'm glad you can, because I'm not sure I can.
Is it the fact that it started as a science research-oriented place that, therefore, almost by definition, right, research is embracing failure?
Right, and that the scientific method embraces not only failure, it embraces hypothesis testing, which is an integral loop that says, I have a hypothesis, I design an experiment, I run it, oops, it blows up, but I learned something to modify that hypothesis. And so that loop is just constantly running.
What do you think can be done to bring that culture to other places? How do you address that? I mean, I want to talk to Brad Feld about this because obviously he's written a book and thinks about it, but I've never really thought much about it that way, that you really do have to change the culture.
So I'm about to blog about this, but let me put it in a blog, a pitch for Brad's book, October 9th, coming out on regional startups. But I've now traveled quite a bit in teaching entrepreneurs in Chile and Helsinki and Russia, and this summer teaching in Delft, the Netherlands. And every place I've been, literally in the last 5 years, there's been an explosion of entrepreneurship around major universities and around technology centers in a way that just didn't exist before. And what's very interesting is when you write something or I write something or this video goes out, instantaneously they're reading it in 15 different countries immediately, which was okay. The globalization and the world is flat really comes home that way. But how it's interpreted really depends on the local culture. And what we're finding is that culture is starting to grow to embrace failure in a way that didn't exist when you were in London, and didn't exist 5 or 10 years ago. That and the availability of local risk capital are the two pieces that are missing. But one of them is going to get fixed over time, and that is the culture is shifting. People now understand that entrepreneurship might be the 21st century new business model for growing corporations in a way that it wasn't important before. And if we could find local capital to do that, the culture is going to come as well. I think the culture is now understood as a missing element and is going to change, and is changing as we speak.
Well, I'm going to take a question from the audience here, and I'm not going to read the name he's listed because I'm certain it's not his real name. But he says, do you think it's hard to replicate Silicon Valley? I feel it's a bad idea to replicate it as each place has its own aura and strengths. Your thoughts? And I'll at least say his first name is Pramod.
Oh, I thought it was Vivek.
No. We have him specifically barred from asking questions.
No, he has a great point. So think about it. In fact, if any of you haven't seen it, I've done my version of Silicon Valley history called The Secret History of Silicon Valley. It's on YouTube. You could go watch it. If you want to know the real history of the Valley, take a look at that video, but there's also a book by a brilliant professor at Berkeley, Annalise Saxenian, who wrote a book called Regional Advantage. Okay. The sum of those two will kind of tell you the real history of the Valley. And the summary is, it was a series of unintended consequences. There was no plan here. Silicon Valley started as a weapons systems valley in the middle of the Cold War. We made submarine-launched ballistic missiles. Lockheed was the largest employer in Silicon Valley, went from 0 to 25,000 engineers in 4 years.
Wow.
I mean, just immense. We built not only submarine-launched ballistic missiles, we built every spy satellite.
So there is, if I avoid getting too political, but there is an argument for government investment in engineering and science that can play a reverberating benefit many years later.
The equivalent of, the government had nothing to do with Silicon Valley is the same response I once heard from a Navy SEAL who said, technology? I don't need any technology. Just give me my weapon and my GPS, and then I'm just fine. And you're going to want GPS, $12 billion satellite system? Yeah. Well, no, it's this little handheld. That's all I need. Yeah. So the Valley not only came from that, venture capital was started because of the Soviet Union. Do you know that?
I didn't know that.
So it turns out in 1957, the Soviets launched the first satellite. The U.S. Congress panics that we're falling behind. And so they launched the SBIC program, Small Business Investment Corporation, which for the first, 10 or 12 years funded 3/4 of all the venture capital funds in the U.S. by matching them 3-for-1. And it wasn't until Arthur Rock and Tommy Davis popularized the limited partnership that most VCs were SBIC funded rather than limited partnerships. And it was because the Soviets scared the heck out of the U.S. Congress. So not only was entrepreneurship kind of seed funded by the government and defense contracts, so was venture capital.
It's funny, the SBIC is still trying to play this role. So basically, the hypothesis of the SBIC, it's hard to say that, is that too much capital is now being concentrated in Silicon Valley. Right. And they believe that there are smart people in other places where if you end up getting a huge startup community but don't have local capital, those people are either going to have to come to Silicon Valley or are at a disadvantage. So they're now with a new program trying to fund regional-based VCs.
Right. So, one of the countries that got it right was Israel in trying to build their own Valley-based culture. And they did it by funding incubators and VCs and then getting out of the business. I believe the government's role is to kind of incent, but not to pick winners and losers personally. And if they could figure out how to do that adroitly, and that's the real key word, is adroitly, rather than ending up with 15 cylinders, which brings up another point, is not only is the government bad at picking winners and losers, is winners and losers turns into a game of gotcha in a non-crisis environment.
Right.
When you have,
but it's interesting because, and I agree with you, I think they ought to stay out of the business of picking winners and losers. At the same point in time, I think many of us champion the success of Tesla, which, of course, without government loans wouldn't have become the Tesla that we know and love
sure,
today.
but if you really think about it, Tesla with government loans with anybody else other than Elon Musk would have been Solyndra.
Probably.
Right?
Yeah.
So what you really want is the combination of a world-class entrepreneur who's capable of turning that into something spectacular. Right.
So back to your books, I want to, if we could bring it to my computer screens for a minute. You wrote a book some time ago called The 4 Steps to Epiphany. That has become a huge success in Silicon Valley. You will not find any product managers who are serious startup folk or even later stage in startups who are building businesses without having read this. So if you don't live in the Valley and you don't know about this book, you should pick that up. If for nothing else, you'll know exactly what all your competitors are reading. But more recently, you've come out with this book, The Startup Owner's Manual, the step-by-step guide for building a great company. What prompted this? What do you, if you could distill it for people down to why they should read this book or what its main thesis is, what would you say?
So the 4 Steps to the Epiphany is still an interesting read, I've been told, because it actually is the beginning of the lean startup movement right in that one book. That was basically the notes for my class that I taught at Berkeley on customer development. Actually, it was Eric Ries who told me to stop giving him out his notes and slap a cover on them and put them on Amazon. So thank you, Eric, for doing that. And the joke for almost 5 or 6 years is because they were in my notes, most of the sentences were unfinished. There were commas in random places. In fact, there were sentences so unfinished you could have wrote your own conclusion to the book.
Yeah.
And so people for years said, well, why don't you update the book? And I realized the reason why I wouldn't is that the book didn't need an update. The whole strategy needed an update. That is, the world had moved on and embraced some of the ideas, but in fact, there were a couple of key ideas that the book just didn't talk about. And one is that web and mobile apps move at different speeds than those in physical products and physical channels.
Right.
Right. So, we take for granted that you could put together a web app or a mobile app in weeks, if months, you're kind of late.
But how has that speed changed your thinking?
So it changed my thinking that you actually need to think that the process, while globally is the same, the details and the tactics are quite different. And trying to find, for example, a unified theory about, how do you do customer relationships on web, mobile, and physical and still stay sane? So, for example, how do you get customers for a mobile app? Well, it's about customer acquisition and activation. Well, how do you get customers into a physical, brick and mortar store? Well, we have about 100 years of doing that, and how do those kind of contrast and compare? And so what I was looking for was a kind of a unified way to tell that story. And finally, with the Startup Owner's Manual with my co-author, Bob Dorff, I think we have a fairly good, almost encyclopedia for entrepreneurs. It's not a novel. I would not read it end to end. It's certainly not like the Lean Startup where you read it and religion happens at the end. It's actually a reference manual. If you're an entrepreneur and you want a reference manual on your desk to know what to do at each step, there it is.
Yeah, and I have a copy here. It's quite a thick book, so you've got...
That's why there's now a Kindle version.
Yeah. But it's nice to have one of these on your desk so you know what to look back to. And, it talks a lot about customer discovery, customer validation. One of the things you said in your online course, as I told you, I watched part of it, was that startup companies are not just big companies that are starting. They're fundamentally different. And we talked a little bit about that at the outset. But I think that there is really... It's got to be not just about the search for your business, but also part of the culture and the ethos of the people and the individuals, no?
Sure. So, if you've ever worked in a large company or for those and for those of your listeners and viewers who have, entrepreneurs know how to make things happen. Because on day one, entrepreneurs and entrepreneurship is an act of vision and aggression at the same time. And no one ever uses the word aggression. I want to put it on the table. It's a force of will to create something from nothing.
Yep.
And the whole culture starts from there. Founders actually bring a different game. And in fact, if you look at what goes wrong in large companies, typically those that were startups not too long ago, is that they've removed all the founders, either from management or they've left, et cetera. I mean, i.e., take a look at Yahoo or some of the others. And so founders bring very special DNA into the company. They know how to create something. And in fact, I do want to mention, I'm going to tell you something that I've only shared with my classes, but never share in a large audience. I'll tell it to you and your audience. I used to do this survey in my class until it made enough people uncomfortable, but I now have enough data to believe it's true. A disproportionate number of founders in Silicon Valley come from dysfunctional families.
Right.
And see, you already...
I believe it.
And the reason why I believe it is that they grew up bringing order out of chaos. Okay. And in fact, in the fog of battle where everybody else is panicking and whatever, they go, normal day, you know. Hey, no one's like throwing something at me. It's actually a calm day. And actually gives them, for the first time in their careers, a advantage they've never had in their life before. It's also the bad news, and it explains why these types of founders, when they actually find a repeatable business, start throwing hand grenades into their own company.
Right.
Why? Because it's not chaotic enough. It's now becoming, scalable and repeatable. Gee, I need some more chaos. And the minute I say that, the other half of the room goes, well, that explains, who I'm working for.
Honestly, that really is eye-opening to me, because I've seen this behavior in a lot of companies. Even as they start to get really fast growth, then all of a sudden I see the founders with destructive behavior.
Right. And you know what? I came up with this theory, tested it on a bunch of entrepreneurs, and then tested it on a mentor of mine, a venture capitalist named Catherine Gould, who had been my board member a couple of times. And she looked at me and said, why, Steve? Why, of course. That's why we picked you.
Yeah.
Damn. I said, why didn't you tell anybody? She said, that was our secret sauce. We just picked, the CEOs who we thought would overachieve because of that. By the way, there's something else. So I want to talk about the secret memo that VCs never share with entrepreneurs.
Oh, share with me.
So the secret memo is, I tend to think of the life cycle of a company going from search for a business model to execute when it scales. But there's a secret kind of step in the middle, which I call build. And that's where you go from, we found the repeatable model, to now we need to build functional organizations.
Yep.
And if you're that CEO who's now excited, he's going into the board meeting, or she's going to the board meeting saying, yes, I'm here to tell my board we're scaling, it's looking like this. You're clearing the cubicle aisles and you're bringing confetti in just so your employees could throw the confetti when the board is having your parade down the aisles, and you've actually worn a sport jacket so they could pin the medal on you. But instead, you go into the board meeting, you announce this thing is repeatable like this, and all of a sudden the board members are looking at you in a way that's making you personally very uncomfortable.
Because now it's time for a CEO.
Now they're all sitting and calculating.
Yeah.
They didn't even know your name when they pulled into the parking lot because they're sitting on 8 to 12 boards.
Yep.
You just told them that there's a dollar sign over the door frame of your company, and all of a sudden this is liquidity where everything else in their portfolios, whatever. They're looking at you going, what, Mark? What are they thinking?
Wow, they're thinking, first of all, how can I bring in a professional team because you're chaotic and causing lots of problems?
But that was good last week, wasn't it? Right?
Exactly.
That was exactly the skill set.
How can I get more dollars into this company because this is one of my winners, and VC's about putting more dollars behind your winners?
Now, how come VCs don't tell you that when they're giving you the Series A?
I don't know.
Well, because if anybody does, you're going to go somewhere else.
Yeah.
Right? So when I ask my VC friends, how come we're not all open about the secret, what I call the secret memo? They'll go, are you out of your mind? If I'm the only firm talking about how big... And so now what I tell entrepreneurs is, why don't you just ask, after profitability, what percentage of your founders are still running their companies?
Right.
And different firms have different investment models about who they pick and how they grow their startups. So Steve's tip for entrepreneurs, if your goal is to actually be a long-term CEO, you ought to understand that there's a different skill set you need that you aren't going to pick up by osmosis. And this is why entrepreneurs come up with the VC stole my company and brought in the suit.
Yep.
When in fact, not understanding that there wasn't an honest conversation on the table going, we loved you when you were flying around the world 24/7, bouncing off of walls, trying to find that repeatable model. But when you found it, our interest kind of diverged. Is that fair?
It makes sense. It
Right?
makes a lot of sense. And I guess there have been different solutions to this. The most famous recent is Mark Zuckerberg and Sheryl Sandberg, because I don't think anyone would be fooled into thinking Mark runs the day-to-day of all of the organization of Facebook.
But you think about, the irony is most founders get blown out of their startups.
Right.
But the bigger irony is the world's largest technology companies were run by their founders.
Of course.
Right? Gates,
Bill
Ellison,
Or Steve Jobs. Yeah.
But if you look what it took them to stay in charge, Jobs had to walk in the wilderness for 13 years until he grew up.
Right.
And actually learned how to be an operating executive. He was just the search guy in Apple I.
Right.
But when he came back again, if you understood what he did is he learned how to have world-class operating executives underneath him. You look what Gates did. He went through, 4 or 5 presidents of Microsoft, tossing them out every time he learned something new. Ellison almost lost Oracle until he brought in Ray Lane.
Yeah.
And so you could go through the checklist and go, they all went through a crisis of trying to go from the go-go days of search into how to build operational excellence into a company, going through that build phase. And I think we do just a bad job of that in general in explaining that to entrepreneurs.
So when I talk about the types of people that I think make great founders, number one, I tend to like people with a chip on their shoulder. I talk a lot about that. And what I like to say is if you're born in the country club, and no offense against people who went to country clubs, but if you're born in the country club and you went to all the right schools and you got all the right degrees and you worked at Goldman Sachs and, your wife or husband has a certain expectation about like the community that you're part of, it's really hard to stick your middle finger up and say that things need to be different. And I think that willingness and maybe desire to stick your middle finger up and say things aren't right here is an important part of entrepreneurship, because it's an important part of trying to force change. Do you think there's some truth to that?
Well, yes, and it's the people who just see things differently, and I think it's people who have less to risk, and also who are great at pattern recognition. One of the we tend to list the types of things that entrepreneurs need to be good at: agility, tenacity, persistence, relentless. Curiosity to me is one of those things that don't often make the list. But I think if you're just a domain expert in one area and not great in a series of others, you'll never get that pattern recognition skill that needs to go on back and forth.
Now, Mark Landay, who is local here in Los Angeles, a recruiter, says, what did Steve learn the most from your company, Epiphany?
Wow. So Epiphany happened in the dot-com bubble, and I learned about rapid growth. I learned about bringing in a operating executive for that build phase. I learned about having great co-founders and partners. Epiphany was one of those great success stories. I'm happy to talk about it, but for me, the best one I like to talk about is the one that I created, because I learned a lot more about that, but I'm happy to talk about either one.
Well, I'm going to hopefully just stop you for a moment here, because there's one thing we need to do is get the show paid for.
Okay.
We have 2 sponsors, the first of which is Detroit Venture Partners.
Love those guys.
Yeah, they are great. And I spent time with them. They've been on the show. I feel like they have both a certain creativity that I don't always see from VCs, and they have a mission of really transforming a city, which I think is wonderful.
That's because they're ex-entrepreneurs.
Right. Exactly. Right. So Josh Linkner is the managing director. He's also published several books. Their Twitter handle is @DVPTweets. Right. And they do like to invest in Michigan. They are open to investing in other areas. I know they invested at least in a San Diego company that I took a look at that I quite liked. Now, you actually dropped out of school, right?
I did.
And the school you dropped out of was?
Well, I dropped out of 2 of them. I
Okay.
dropped out of both Michigan State as a pre-med and
Okay.
at University of Michigan as an engineer.
Yeah.
And every time I go back to U of M and start my talks with the dean of engineering in the room saying, I'm glad to be back at the best school I was ever thrown out of. You can just see him kind of vibrate. But yes.
And well, that seems to be a trait also of entrepreneurs, that often they didn't finish college.
You know, I'm not sure I could still get into the colleges I now teach at.
Yeah.
But
Is there something about, like, I wonder, maybe it's just mythology, but I've often thought that ADD
yep.
and entrepreneurship go hand in hand.
You know, some part of it is that, you know, I am curious. I am still curious. I
Yeah.
still get Science and Nature and Aviation Week and read about a lot of things, still interested in military and military history. And I am spread across a lot of things. But boy, when I need to focus, I can focus. So, you know, I don't know if it's ADD. I think it's maybe a weird combination that hasn't even been
Have you
explained.
read much about ADD?
Not. You're painting me in a corner that I
Yeah.
don't wish I was standing in.
Okay, well, I'll move on,
No.
moving right along. So I read a book called Delivered from Distraction,
Yeah.
and I realized that I had ADD when I think I was 40.
Really?
Yeah. And it's because my assistant told me, Mark, you have ADD, you need to read this book. I'm like, come on. And, you know, like, we Americans think that we overdiagnose things like ADD, so I was really quick to discount it. So she gave me this book, and if anyone wonders if you might have ADD, I highly recommend the book, Delivered from Distraction. And it goes through a checklist of all the things that compose someone with ADD. And it actually tries to dispel the myth that people with ADD are not functioning at high levels. In fact, some of the most creative people and productive people in business have had ADD. So they profile the founder of JetBlue, and then he went on to create this airline in Brazil. I don't remember what it's called. I think Azul, Aero Azul or something. They talked about how he struggled at Southwest because of his ADD. For example, people with ADD have a very hard time sitting through meetings. And they have a hard time because people in meetings are very structured and very ordered and tend to be very long-winded. And I tend to just blurt out my opinion. And when people are getting long-winded and I blurt out my opinion, it makes for awkward moments. And that's what they were talking about, this guy in the book in Southwest Airlines. So they tend not to like order. They tend to thrive a bit on chaos. They tend to be very good at concentrating, but they tend to be less good of completer finishers. And I find that in my own life. Like, I always surrounded myself with a CFO and a COO who were really good at the last 15 or 20%, because once I'd exhausted the creative thought that I had, I'm just not that guy.
So we're going to get pretty good in the next 10 years, I predict, out of actually figuring out what's the right type for founders. You know what I mean, right? I don't know if VCs are ever going to do personality tests, because I think they do them instinctually.
Yeah.
But I think what you're describing and what I've been describing is not mainstream, personality types.
Yeah.
I think that's kind of interesting.
I want to talk about Y Combinator. And I won't put you on the spot, but the reason I want to talk about it, well, I'll give you wiggle room if you want to avoid it. But I first want to talk about the dichotomy between customer development and Y Combinator.
Well, Y Combinator is a cult, so so there immediately is a dichotomy. I mean, Paul is the guru of the cult, and in this case, it's a benign cult, and maybe a beneficial one for its graduates. But it is the cult of Paul and Jessica.
Why do you say it's a cult?
Well, listen, I'm not an expert in Y Combinator, and I think what they've done for the Valley is spectacular. And by the way, if any of you haven't read Jessica Livingston's book,
Founders at Work.
Founders at Work, if any of your anybody has ever been forced to read a Harvard case study, this embarrasses them to death, because they're actually Harvard case studies without the Hollywood rewrites.
Right.
This is really how Founders did work, and how she got those people to admit their cycle of just an incredible read.
Yeah.
You can't read it as a novel. They're vignettes of about 20 or 30 of them, but they're incredibly well written. And Paul's essays, by the
Yep.
way, are incredibly insightful
Phenomenal.
as well.
Yeah.
Phenomenal. I put them on par with Mark Andreassen's writings, which, by the way, inspired me to blog.
Yeah.
After I read Andreassen's stuff, I said,
When he first started writing, I mean,
it was
everyone was
best
reading
thing on
it.
the web.
Yeah.
And so Paul, I think, is up there as well. But, Y Combinator has gone from, I kind of think of the generations of incubators,
Idea Lab.
Idea Labs here with Bill Gross in maybe 1999. Actually started, first incubator was in Rochester, New York, or much earlier, but as Generation 1. And it was basically Bill's ideas spread out, right? Generation 2 for me is Paul, where it's guru-based. It's basically Paul and, the network and whatever. Generation 3 is Brad Feld and Techstars, where no, it's not guru-based, it's mentor-based, and we're going to distribute it.
Right.
I don't think we're done. I think, and again, this is where I come from, is we're doing a disservice to entrepreneurs in just assuming there's no methodology at all, and if we have a lot of dinners enough and tell a lot of war stories, it's actually going to be great. I just think we now know things that we ought to enrich entrepreneurs with. We now know some of the things they ought to be doing about customers, about products, about pricing, etc. And we ought to, if not insist on them by straitjacketing them, but at least giving them a series of best practices. And so I believe there'll be a next generation of incubators that take it to the next step.
So
Did I dodge the Y Combinator question, or
you
you're going to
did.
let me go back to it?
You did, but I want to ask it in a different way, which you can just say no if we want to move on to the next topic. Customer development to me suggests that before you go do a bunch of shit, you should go out and talk to customers, get feedback, create something, go back to them, and have this kind of cycle that requires a certain amount of thinking time.
Sure.
And I wonder, my only question mark, so I also, and I guess we're supposed to say this, but I really believe it. I believe that what they're producing is a lot of goodness overall. But I sometimes feel like you get the half-thought-through business that is built by hackers to see if they can get growth without much thought if there's a customer need behind what they're building.
Sure. But if you get them all funded and you own a big chunk of them, it works for you. And it works for, people who hold up the I graduated from Y Combinator certificate. And so, there's value in that ecosystem. There's a question of whether that's the best way to build long-term companies.
What about this if I pivot the question?
That's Eric's word. I love it.
Yeah. So there is a lot of thought now that you shouldn't create business plans. And if I delineate...
That's mine.
Yeah, but if I delineate business plans from should you write an 85-page Word document that's a tome, if I get rid of that and I say should you have a financial model, and that being my definition of a business plan, I believe that too many companies these days don't take the time to do the basic financial analysis about the viability of their model.
Sure, of course you need to do that.
So I feel like there needs to be a thought of, okay, if I'm going to introduce this new product, if I'm expecting large numbers of users to start using my product every single day, well, what are they going to give up? Because even if they're not paying for it, I think the hardest thing to persuade people, consumers anyway, is for their time. So you get a lot of products that everyone rushes to. Like, I don't know if you remember this company, Oink. Do you remember Oink?
No.
It was launched by Kevin Rose. And it was, rate what you're eating at a restaurant and take a picture. And I saw that and I immediately called bullshit on it. And yet the tech press wrote about it because it was Kevin Rose, who is one of, a lot of people's hero for Dig and other things. And everyone raced to download it and everyone used it and everyone was talking about it for about 30 days. And then on to the next thing. I mean, aren't we getting to a point where Silicon Valley is trying to build hit businesses in the way LA traditionally tried to build hit movies, and without the research going into a lot of this, we end up with a lot of Me Too scripts?
Well, it'll be a hits business if there's, only a sucker at the other end, right? That is, you could only keep flipping these businesses to each other until there's either a liquidity event or somebody dumber at the end is owning something that's overvalued, and the guys who funded the seed or Series A have cashed out.
I guess that's a bit of the Groupon situation.
Or, Facebook at its price or Zynga at its price.
Right.
I mean, these weren't valueless businesses, but it was the greater fool theory at the price.
Right.
People think Facebook was a failure IPO, not to the guys who cashed out $15 billion.
Right.
People think Zynga was not to, Mark Pincus, who took out gosh knows how much. I mean, thank you very much.
$200 million.
Thank you. All right. Laughing all the way to the bank. Not the guys who bought the stock at that price. But so as long as we have that and the SEC no longer counts for anything in this country, then people will play these Ponzi schemes all the way on. And so, who participates? I mean, the investors participate because there's money to be made at each stage, and, entrepreneurs participate because if you flip it early enough and you get to cash out some of your stuff. But there's still a group of companies and people who want to build real companies that last for a while. And there are others who want to do financial engineering. Financial engineering is what we did in the last bubble. We stopped being company builders. I want to remind you and your audience is that in the 1980s, you couldn't take a company public in Silicon Valley without 5 profitable quarters. Not that there was a law. It was just that the
market wouldn't buy the stock.
They would just laugh at you, and you'd be in the penny. But when the bubble happened, in fact, it was the day Netscape happened, proved that there was a market for things that didn't have real profits. And okay, so VCs stopped being company builders and started being financial engineers. When the bubble crashed, they had to be the people, shoveled out the rubble for a couple of years. I think we're back into the phase of bubble time again, where we're doing financial engineering and not company building. We'll get back to company building because this thing eventually will end. And there's other parts of the industry that's funding things that really matter.
You have talked about how you believe that most true disruption over the last period of 5-10 years has only come from 2 individuals, Elon Musk and Sebastian Thrun. And I'm sure you're reducing that to make it a nice headline.
Just to make a point.
But when you look at SpaceX and Tesla from Elon Musk, when you look at Sebastian, who built the driverless cars and Google Glasses and is now doing Udacity, right? Yep. Online education. It does seem like there is a bankruptcy of big ideas and big audacious plans, doesn't it?
That's not bad for Silicon Valley, but it is kind of scary. It's 2 people. I've been lucky enough to know Sebastian through his career at Stanford, and we've invested in some things together, and we got to work on my class together at Udacity, and full disclosure, I'm an investor. And what I was reminded of, I don't remember Elon Musk, but someone reminded me he was our intern at Rocket Science.
So funny.
At a video game company called Rocket Science, and I hope it inspired him to SpaceX, but I find it very funny. Silicon Valley has always encouraged people who are dreamers with big vision. Right now, the money, as I said, the giant sucking sound is going to social media. But eventually I believe we'll get back to building big things and important things.
And it's interesting because as much as social media doesn't always seem profound, I actually think that Twitter has the potential to be one of the most profound technologies of our era. And not everyone agrees, but my rationale is simple, which is if you look at the printing press, and if you look at radio and then television, if you look at telephony, all of these things had the ability to improve communication from peer to peer. Right. Well, television less so, but telephone certainly peer to peer. And you look at the distribution of press and the introduction of the internet itself being a peer to peer technology. And what Twitter seems to me to do is to be able to allow disparate crowds to be able to connect with other people without hierarchy, and I think that's pretty profound.
Sure. Listen, clearly Twitter's changing our lives. clearly the net is transforming every business we're in. Of course, that's profound.
Yeah.
The comment I made was the 7,000, every class I have is, 6 teams doing real estate apps and 6
Right.
doing whatever, yet their parents sent them to Stanford or Berkeley to get their PhD in whatever,
Right.
and they're doing mobile apps with, 14 years of education.
Usually targeting bars and restaurants.
Bars and
right?
restaurants, and they have another nightclub app like no one's
Yeah.
ever thought of that.
Yeah.
And after you see about 300 of them, and I got to
Yeah.
assume as investors, you should just
600.
have them,
Yeah.
press 1
Yeah.
for a nightclub app, press 2 from
Yeah.
another real estate app.
Yeah.
But imagine this energy if it was actually put in something that just 4,000 people aren't doing. And the reason why we're seeing all this is that it's very easy to make quick money because, boy, why should I spend 14 years investing in life sciences to make $1 billion when, look at Instagram. How come we have a life sciences group of an a VC? Why don't we shut that down and put the money in these things? Because that happened in 2.5 years. Okay?
But it's sort of an aberration, like it's the lottery ticket to end up with Instagram somewhat.
So let me know the last time venture capital actually led an innovation. Right, and I will push back and say, as an industry, venture capital is now being disrupted by new entrants rather than the existing players. Everybody from Dave McClure to Andreessen were outsiders who
Yep.
tended to be entrepreneurs themselves.
Right.
You yourself
Yep.
come from that background, and I think that's where the innovation in venture capital is coming from.
And I had a healthy skepticism for the venture industry when I joined it. Let's talk about education.
Yeah, love it.
So you have now done this course as part of Udacity. Sebastian himself made his computer science classes at Stanford more publicly available. What do you think's going on? Is this a big category? Is it going to change things in this country? Are we broken? Are we bankrupt as an educational system?
This is a 50-year-old new category. There was something called Plato in the late 1960s. They ran on the ILLIAC 4, then on controlled data equipment. Stanford granted 15,000 master's degrees in engineering via video, and half of them were to HP engineers in Colorado in the 70s and 80s. And the program just kind of ended through political pressures inside of Stanford. So online education is not new, but what's really happening here is that the platforms, the bandwidth, all this stuff is intersecting at a really interesting time. And it's not just the technology. We're having the equivalent of the housing meltdown crisis for education.
Right.
I mean, if you think about it, the top schools now charge $50,000 a year. You could rack up $200,000 a year in bills. The average 4-year university private tuition, $35,000 a year average.
Right.
Yet the government.
And that's just for tuition.
That's just for tuition. Well, it actually includes room and board. Okay.
Oh, it includes room and board. Okay.
But if you think about it, the government funds that.
Okay.
So they allow you to get into debt. It's not like they're giving it to you as a gift. They're giving you as a gift that you now owe money forever, just like they gave you as a gift that said, here's this mortgage. And you were now able to buy an overpriced house. Now you're able to buy an overpriced college education.
Except there's no bankruptcy allowed.
Very interesting, isn't it? So I think we're at this funny tipping point where people are desperate for a solution. The Stanfords and the Ivy Leagues and the whatever with the brands won't go away. Because if you look at the Stanford student to faculty ratio, it's 6-1. But if you look at a state school like in California, UC Berkeley, it's 15-1.
Right.
And if you look at San Jose State, it's 30-1. Well, these schools desperately need some kind of leverage to be able to offer more with less. Not fire teachers, but actually be more productive. And I see these kind of courses as kind of extend the ability to offer inexpensive degrees and inexpensive education almost on par of the best that's being offered elsewhere.
I see a couple things combining. One is the obvious innovator's dilemma. When you become these big, educational institutions, you're geared up to a cost structure.
Right.
That doesn't allow you to necessarily compete with the barbarians at the gate. So I almost feel like it's more likely to come from without rather than from within.
Well, if you think about what the University of Phoenix did, right? So here was a generation of for-profit schools that actually cut in half, or at least by 50%, the cost of a private education.
Yeah.
I think online education is going to do the same thing, and it's not going to disrupt the Ivy League schools. They will, in fact, if you look at what's happening at Stanford, just offered a certificate in entrepreneurship and innovation. You can get a certificate from Stanford for $1,000 for a class. Don't even have to show up. MIT and Harvard and University of Pennsylvania, and lots of companies are lots of campuses are jumping into this. But I think the disruption is going to happen in the second-tier schools. Is why should you be paying $25,000 a year when there's other alternatives?
And to some extent, and you and I have talked about this, to some extent, I think we in Silicon Valley or in the venture circles talk a lot about trying to find the upper tier of entrepreneurs and solving the problems for the upper tier. I think we've got a real problem in this country trying to solve for East Mississippi State, and I'm assuming there's an East Mississippi State.
Right, and if you think about it, it's not only for them. About half my students, or maybe more, are from outside the U.S. who never had access to this quality education anywhere at any price inside their country. It was just kind of amazing to see the demographic slice of who was signing on to the class. And so we might just be by accident, while we're thinking we're solving a U.S. problem, actually democratizing education around the world in a way that we just never expected.
Well, that's interesting too, because as you know, we have a group of people in Brazil who are all gathered for a entrepreneur tech startup meeting, and they're sitting and watching this live. So, I guess even if you look at shows like this, being able to get knowledge from Steve Blank directly to remote parts of the world, not remote for us on a relative basis.
I love Brazil. One of the first classes I ever taught was microprocessor design in Sao Paulo, and then ended up going to Manaus and Belém. So hello to Brazil.
Awesome. And I wonder, if you think about education, and I'll state the obvious, education has a lot of the typical structures that we disrupt in business. It has physical location. It has limited availability because of classes and class sizes. It's expensive. And you take those three things together, it seems obvious to me that technology can begin to replace that. Now, there is a certain amount of hands-on and interacting that you don't quite get.
Right, so be careful. You don't go to Stanford and Harvard just for the faculty.
But hear me out for 1 second. So I believe that at Stanford, Harvard, Wharton, Yale, Princeton, I believe in the case that people always pay a premium for those. There will always be a case for people being in person. The problem is, if you're at East Mississippi State, and no disrespect, because I don't even know if it exists, and you graduate with a degree, let's say in, liberal arts, so I don't have to pick an exact one, that didn't have applicability, and you took on $27,000 of debt, and the average salary in your local area is paying $20,000 a year coming out, and there's no jobs, 16% unemployment, youth unemployment in this country.
Welcome to disruption. That's exactly who it's going to disrupt.
Right, and there's now $1 trillion of student debt in this country. It's now larger than credit card debt, and it's grown in real terms, not nominal, but real terms, 100% over the last 10 years. And I feel like this is something that has to break. And for me, the way it has to break, and I would love to see startups that solve it, you need to legitimize different career types into businesses so that they're willing to hire people who don't have a 4-year degree. Just like in Silicon Valley, no one gives a shit if you have a degree, if you're a great programmer.
Is that a technical term?
It is. It is. It's short for shiitake. But no one cares at all. Like if they see you on Stack Exchange or you submitted stuff on GitHub, they just care about the quality of what you produce. And I feel like when we get that kind of legitimacy into corporations in other fields, we'll have done ourselves a great service.
Well, it's an interesting argument because it goes full circle. I mean, what you might be proposing is we're going to go back to, online vocational schools. And yet the notion of a university was to, educate the whole student, right? This whole, right?
To build a complete man or woman.
Right. And so the question is that, is that affordable anymore? And will that only be available for the elite?
When I wrote about my response to Peter Thiel's 20 Under 20, what I actually said was I gained so much more out of the experience of university than I did in my classes. And don't forget, I had ADD, which meant I didn't sit through all my classes. But when I think about, I learned how to write, I learned critical thinking. I ran a fraternity, so I think I learned more about how to lead and manage and organize people before I actually went into the workforce than being in the workforce. And you're finding yourself because it's the first time you're without your parents. So I agree with all that. The problem is you have to balance out the debt that it takes now to get through that period of time with the job opportunities and prospects and your ability to pay that out. And I just think it doesn't add up for everybody. I wish everybody could have that, but I still think we would do a great service to a lot of middle class and lower middle class people in this country if we trained them and got them to work without the debt.
Well, I think you're proposing something rational, which means in our current political environment it's almost impossible to have a conversation. Because the promise of a 4-year education to at least most Americans is kind of like the promise of owning your own home.
Right.
Oops, we know how well that worked out.
Yep.
But we have not yet had the default crisis. And in having this education debate, we forget the other party that actually has a vested interest in it, and that's teachers' unions.
Yep.
And that's also a third rail to have a conversation about in the United States.
If you haven't learned anything about that issue, you should go see the film. Not you, I'm sure you've seen it, but Waiting for Superman.
Right.
Because I think that spoke volumes to what's wrong with the teachers' unions in the country.
Right. Since I'm a member of a teachers' union,
Yep.
I'm not going to take whether it's right or wrong. I'm
Yep.
just suggesting that they are another constituent that needs
Yep.
to be thought about in this discussion, at least in the United States. So that's my 2 cents on.
But when we have an education system that rewards teachers for some performance-based metrics and allows people to earn amazing remuneration for great performance or also to be terminated when they're not performing,
Then we'll have charter schools.
Yeah.
Right.
But that's when I'll subscribe to the fact that we've done the proper tweaks to the teachers' unions to make them effective.
There is an interesting observation I will make about unions. When the technology emerged to containerize ships in New York Harbor, one of the strongest unions was the Longshoremen's Union. And how the heck were they going to deal with these unions who, will go on strike at drop of a hat? Do you know how they solved the problem in New York? They came up with what I thought was really kind of innovative. They promised them jobs for life. For life. They're not going to let them hire anymore. But in fact, you know what? Congratulations. You just show up at the union hall every day, and if there's no job for you, but you have to show up, as long as you want to do that, you could collect a paycheck, and the owners were free to automate the ships. We might have to do something like that for teachers. You know what? We are going to be efficient on how we design education, but if you want a job for life, in doing that, we might have to do that.
But are you saying with the longshoremen that if you were a current longshoreman, had a job for life, but no future people did? So
there were no new hires.
Right. So
solve the problem.
But what you're sort of admitting in saying
I'm
that,
not admitting anything.
what one would
My
have,
parents were union members since the 1920s, so
Yeah.
I'm not going to sit here and bash unions.
nor was I. What one would have to conclude in that is that those people had gotten to a point where they were strictly looking after their own best interests. And I know that that's the case with capitalism, full stop. But when it supersedes the benefits to the system, that's when it becomes a problem. By the way, I'm not anti-union either. I do believe, though, that unions, and particularly the teachers' union.
Hey, how about Y Combinator?
Yeah. But I'll say my last bit, but then I won't ask you about it. I think do need to be constructed in a way where we can overpay great teachers and where we can terminate those who don't perform. And that seemed to be the basis of a compromise that Michelle Rhee brought to Washington, D.C.
And we know how well that turned out.
It didn't, as you know. So anyway, we won't belabor that. I think we're probably about towards the end. I just want to ask you one more theme of a question. And before I do that, I want to say thank you to Walker Corporate Law, who's a sponsor of our show. Scott.
Smart guy. So I like Scott.
Yeah, Scott. What I like about Scott is that he's very transparent about the legal industry. He talks openly about it. He publishes about it. He gives you opinions. Yeah, he's a very good blogger. Gives you opinions on things. And I find that with a lot of lawyers, they're not willing to give you strong opinions one way or the other. His Twitter handle is Scott Ed Walker, SCOTTED Walker, WALKER. And he's actually written here, if you want to call him directly, it's 310-288-6667.
I'm going to be calling him right now.
Ominous phone number, 666. Startups equal growth. A recent blog post making its way around the Valley. And when I read my Twitter feed, it was so emphatically positive about, you must read this, it's the greatest thing ever. Of course, I went and read it, and I read it 4 times, and subsequently now I've read it another 2 times. How did you interpret that? Do startups equal growth?
You know, one of the interesting things is how you kind of define the word startup. And I guess I would just disagree in the first paragraph.
Right.
You know, to me, there are multiple types of startups, and if I read Paul's post correctly, this is Paul Graham at Y Combinator, you know, maybe I misread it, but his whole idea was startups are only those that are high growth activities. And I kind of just go, no, that's, I think, an insult to the, you know, millions of other people in this country who are actually starting something new. I think we have a series of different startups in this country. Silicon Valley, where we breathe our own air, tends to think of them as the only type, and that's a mistake. And that's because we don't get out of the office too often, and we're just kind of hanging out with our peers. I think there's everything from lifestyle startups to small business startups to scalable startups to viable startups to corporate entrepreneuring startups. They all have different characteristics, and I think what this blog post attempted to do was describe, I think, one class of startups, but it was, to me, a little elitist to say those are the only people who are working 24/7. You know, in Silicon Valley and in technology clusters, we tend to ignore the other 99% of what I call mainstream entrepreneurs. And I think those people do have 99% of the vote, and we do that at our peril. I think that, you know, the biggest challenge for this country is if you go to the SBA.gov website, they're still telling you how to write a business plan.
Right.
Now that, I think, is idiotic.
Yeah.
I think we need to embrace the small businesses as a distinct class of startups that actually we ought to apply everything we've learned in the last 5 or 10 years about customer development, about business model design, about lean. Why aren't we teaching the people on Main Street how to do that? We don't have to teach them the fancy words around the canvas, but I think it's very easy to teach them the key concepts. We can make a dramatic improvement in the gross national product by just being much more efficient on how do we start new businesses.
And I want to take a perfect example. There's a restaurant, a sandwich chain in San Francisco called Specialties. Have you been to Specialties? It's actually really good. Just be careful of the cookies. They'll add up quickly. But what they started doing was introducing technology into a sandwich shop. So they brought things that are now a lot more standard, but they brought ordering screens where you could come in and order your own sandwich, where you could order on the internet before you got there, where if they had a fresh batch of cookies, they would put it out on Twitter so you'd know when the cookies were fresh. They started building technology not only into how they served customers, but also how they design product and how they get product out of the kitchen and managing their inventory levels. And it's become a very fast-growing business. So I do think there's a lot that we can even take from technology and customer development into standard businesses as well.
So that's one direction. My other observation is that the article seemed to talk about a very small niche, and it's the one that Y Combinator is in. But in my experience, there are actually multiple types of startups, and these happen to be the ones that were being described were in existing markets. And so you measure the difference between 1% or 7% growth per week, and I thought that was actually very useful metrics in terms of scale. But, you know, when you're talking about new markets, that is markets that don't exist at all, that all you have is the founder's vision that says, no, these are the 3 or 4 pieces that need to happen, and it will take another year or 2. Well, by that definition, they're not startups at all.
Right.
And therefore, no VC would ever invest in them. And that's just not what we do here. It's at least it's not what built Silicon Valley. Not everybody's building web and mobile apps, and that's not the entire world. If that was your universe, then that article made all the sense in the world. I think entrepreneurship is much broader and much more interesting than that narrow view. And I understand where the narrow view came, because again, if you're sitting in your own room looking at your own 65 startups a quarter, that's all you see. I tend to see everything from National Science Foundation guys doing, graphene material science to diffusion pumps to photo sharing apps to whatever, and also see that part of the valley. I think it's much more interesting than.
So I want to tell you just a quick story, Steve, that kind of resonates with what you're saying. I had a guy who, young guy in his 20s, had been working 5 or 6 years in his industry. I won't say it because it'll give away what the company was, but pedestrian industry, not a lot of change. He had built a nice little business for himself, probably was making, I'll just say 50, 60 grand a year at it. Knew all the participants in the industry. It's a pretty small, kind of closed industry. And he kept telling me, but my industry's offline. I have ideas for how I can move it online. So we started debating this for like a year and a half. I then told him, stop talking about this. And he says, well, what do you mean? I said, well, you've been talking about it for a year and a half and you've done nothing. If it was a real opportunity, you would have done something. He says, well, I don't have money. And I said, well, people start businesses every day without money. Well, how do I pay engineers? Well, I don't know. If you really believed in your idea, I'm guessing an engineer would take equity, like a normal startup, right? No joke. Literally the next day, found an engineer to do it and started doing it full time. That enabled him to raise $200,000 from angels because he had his initial client. His client was his normal client in his offline business. Parlayed that. I actually brought him into Launchpad, which is an incubator in LA or an accelerator that I've been involved with since 2009. Through that process, got a lot more awareness and raised a couple $1 million actually, and has built that company out really nicely where it's got, it's never going to be Instagram, it's never going to be Facebook, but he's now a very large owner in a business that is growing at a nice pace, that has huge innovation, and he's never been more excited in his life. Now, that guy, by Silicon Valley standards, would not be, in Paul Graham's words, called a startup. And to me, he's changed his life. He's impacted the design of this particular industry because he's now got the 2 largest players in the industry using his product. And I think people like that should be congratulated.
I think so too. Let me give you one more example, just from the. So one of our first classes at Stanford had some machine vision guys, computer scientists, whose best idea in the class was they wanted to build a robotic lawnmower. And we rolled our eyes, and we made them get out of the building, and pretty soon the robotic lawnmower morphed into a robotic weeding machine for agriculture. And these guys were really excited about this, and they decided to pursue it after the class. And I helped them with some seed money, but this was not a high-growth company. Boy, who in the Valley would talk to you about robotic, agriculture? Precision agriculture turned out to be an actual segment. But they spent the last year and a half building prototypes, getting their hands dirty, going in the field, etc. I just got an email from them last week that they just got $4 million from Khosla Ventures, who now believes precision agriculture is, but trust me, they are not growing 7% a week,
right.
But they might transform agriculture in the United States. This, to me, again, is an example, not to just dump on this, but the view of startups equal growth is just a very narrow view of a class of startups that, in that case, it does. But I think it's just much broader than that.
We spent our partner meeting today talking about a company, 3 young Stanford engineers who are now building a company that's taking drones and for now using them for agricultural purposes to fly over large ag areas and help farmers survey their land. And they're creating a data platform by collecting all the data and surveying that will allow other people to then use this data for other purposes. But I think there's tons of super interesting things, and you look at that business and you wouldn't immediately think, VCs would be chasing something like that, but I think they're really onto something.
So let's see if we ever get talked about in Hacker News ever again.
Yeah. Normally when I'm talked about on Hacker News, it's to say something negative. Because normally I'm talking about persuasion or fundraising or how people need to be more loyal and stay with their jobs for longer, and that tends not to go down very well. But we should bring this to a wrap. I want to thank two people, Detroit Venture Partners, and I want to thank the Walker Law Group. And of course, most of all, I want to thank Steve Blank for being my guest today. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark.